And so glad to have you on with us today. Charles, what's up, my friend?
How's it going? Thanks so much for initiating this conversation.
Man, listen, it's you and I get a chance to chop it up, a couple times a year, and in terms of like real conversations, but we interact pretty regularly on Facebook and social media, and every time, every so often we'll text back and forth on some things that are happening. Man, I admire the work that you do, and particularly because you are a person of faith who is what I would call an interdisciplinarian, in that you do business and you're in other spaces and able to navigate that. And so we're kindred hearts in that way, man. So I'm glad you're able to jump on with me live tonight to let's just have a conversation like we would if we were sitting at a breakfast place or something like that.
Yeah, we did that not too long ago.
We did. We sure did, man. So just for full disclosure for everybody that's tuning in here and watching this, you and I had actually decided to do this before the last 2 or 3 days of news that has broken out. We had the situation that happened in Central Park with
Yeah,
the young lady who essentially lied, calling the police, saying that a gentleman, African American gentleman, was harassing her, and then fresh, hot off the press, the murder that took place by law enforcement officers in Minneapolis. So
yeah,
we had decided to do this even before all of that happened, and that those two things even more cement the need for us to just have this conversation.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, not only with everything that's happening with COVID, but if you look at what's hitting the news line, and I think it's not just sensationalization. I mean, it's just the reality of so many people in our country, and I feel like this is an opportunity for us to really think deeply about some of the issues and figure out a path forward.
Yeah. So let's do this, man. Let's first of all, most, not, I shouldn't say most, but maybe some people don't know your faith background
Yeah,
and your ministry work. They see
yeah,
you as the author, they see you as the business person,
yeah.
the ideas guru, but they may not know some of the context in terms of you serving full time in ministry and all that. So just share it really fast with folks a little bit about some of that.
Yeah, I've been weaving in and out for years, probably less in the last, I don't know, 12 years or so. But I've always tried to be engaged at some level with the local church. And I feel like that's an important part of my own personal faith journey. And it's also a great opportunity to kind of express, the person I value the most, Christ, as well as, the values that I hopefully try to live out as well. And so for me, it's kind of a natural ebb and flow between all areas of my life. It's hard to kind of separate my faith into just one area of life. The
Hey,
reality is it touches everything.
yeah, let me ask you to hold for just 1 second because I think we had a little snafu here on our live streaming. So give me just 1 second,
Okay.
even though we're recording on the other platform. And so we were already getting into our conversation when I realized that for some reason the technology didn't catch up with us, and that's okay. You were just sort of sharing a little bit, Charles, and for those that may have missed the other intro, because I don't know where that video started and stopped, Charles and I are great friends, and I respect him and his work very highly. Charles is one of those folks that when I look at my list in my Rolodex, if you would, and look at people that can challenge me with my thoughts and thought processes, and at least I am motivated about thinking. And Charles is one of those leaders in my Rolodex that kind of helps me do that. So I appreciate our friendship and all those kinds of things. And so everybody may not know your faith background. They see you in the business space. They see you as a consultant, as an
Yeah.
author, especially your book about ideas. So tell everybody a little bit about just your work in the church and the faith community.
Yeah. I mean, faith is part of who I am. I feel like my relationship with Jesus is really central to who I want to be as a human being. And because of that, it naturally spills over into everything I do, whether it's business, whether it's personal relationships, whether it's being involved in the church. So in and out over the years, I've had the privilege of serving in multiple different capacities in local congregations. And so that definitely brings a lot of joy to my life. And part of it is I know some people try to put faith in one compartment of life. And I have a hard time doing that because that's really part of who I am. And so that's been kind of my posture. And I've had the great fortune of working with not only great corporate brands, but some of the best brands within, if you will, quote unquote, brands within faith. And I think that's how we first met years ago in Chicago while working with a church out there as well. So
Yeah.
that's been kind of my approach. I feel like it's pretty integrated into who I am as a human being.
No, absolutely. And as I've heard you say both privately and publicly before, a lot of people may not realize the similarities, but there's major similarities between those that are leading in business space and those that have to lead in faith communities in the faith space.
Yeah.
And to your point, it doesn't have to be compartmentalized at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, if you look at some of the best companies that have ever been around, like a lot of those are led by incredible people of faith. And it's not like always like a faith that is they're proselytizing or anything, but they're trying to be embodiments and representations of the good news of knowing someone like Christ.
Yeah. So to again, we said this earlier in the introduction, but that part got cut off. You and I had actually planned tonight to have this conversation prior to some of the other things that took place over the last, 72 hours or so.
Yeah.
We had already touched base and decided, let's have a conversation. And really us touching bases and saying, let's have a conversation was precipitated by a post that I put on social media last week, centered around my company, my new platform that we started. So I started a new platform, diversechurchjobs.com, and specifically helping people of color, African-American, Hispanic, Asian, get connected to high quality, incredible ministry opportunities, because there's not really a lot of viable options for them to find those kinds of jobs. And so I posted that, and then I tagged a bunch of y'all on that post because
you did.
I wanted to set the comments on fire. But in the comments, there were people who vehemently disagreed with, well, why do you need to have, a firm that, only looks at color, and, aren't we all just one race? And, why does that matter? And then, people started even using scripture to justify, why this is a problem. And so you inboxed me, which I noticed. I said, Charles is trying to stay above the fray.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw the comments, I was like, man, in part, it was really, I think, bad hermeneutics or interpretation of scripture. I thought a lot of the responses were very convenient. A lot of the responses were, excuse me, agenda driven. And I felt really unfair to the topic. I think, whenever you think about like systemic change, even in the context of a church, it has to come with some type of intentional, willful action that may feel like you are unnecessarily giving people access for advancement in a way that feels quote unquote unfair. But having worked in corporations for years and seeing diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, unless someone takes that stance to say, hey, we are going to intentionally work on this. Like if you're going to work on your marriage, you have to intentionally work on it.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, it may feel like quote unquote unnatural, but you need that type of like discipline and behavior in order to create the lasting change you're looking for. Because there's too many things. Because the reality is, if a church is, say, not diverse for whatever reason, and I'm not here to justify or say that a church ought to be diverse to a certain percentage, or I'm not trying to hit quotas. If it's not diverse, there's probably underlying things within it that not so much didn't want diversity, but maybe implicitly prevented diversity.
Yeah.
And that's reality. And to break through that requires systemic commitment from the highest levels of leadership to make the change you want to see.
Why are people so resistant to that? Like, why? I mean, everything that you just said is so powerful, but why do you think, from your perspective, government, society, businesses are so like almost there's a venom behind it, like so resistant to that? Why do you think that is?
I think it's hard for people to change just generally. And, one of the things that I know is like adults often will change if they feel the need to change. Like
Wow.
most people aren't going to like marriage counseling unless their marriage is in trouble. Unless people feel the need to change something versus saying, hey, that'd be nice to have change in this area over coffee. That's a different type of like level of commitment to change.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the reality is that maybe we don't feel we need that. And we're going to have to either like justify, because I think the challenge with like engaging systemic change in a church is because one, at some level, like we're all quote unquote God's people. And if you're a leader in a church, you're almost kind of put on a position where you almost have to be right all the time.
Mm.
So just implying that I need to change something implies possibly that something may have been lacking before. And so it creates all of this like internal, like probably unspoken conflict. Like, how can I still be right in doing what I'm doing? Because I genuinely believe God's called me to do that. And at the same time, welcome new ways of actually expanding our doors, because there's so much benefit. And we've seen all the research supports this. There's so much benefit when you have diverse people in the room. When it comes to innovation, when it comes to in the business sector, profitability, all of those things are there. But beyond that, like, I think it's interesting that some would have a worldview of just kind of justifying some type of homogeneous, principle that was really popular back in the 80s, right?
Yeah.
Like that type of principle driving it. And I feel like our world is so different now. And I think you mentioned that in the article that you were interviewing, and it's like, man, literally like sit in a school cafeteria, see what our world looks like.
Yeah.
And if the church wants to be a reflection, not only a reflection of the world, but exists for all the diverse people in the world, wouldn't we want to become more diverse so that we can be more impactful in the way that we serve our communities?
Yeah. Let's get a little granular just for a minute.
Yeah.
Um, you're a minority here in the United States. I'm a minority here in the United States. Um, and you love the ability to inspire people with ideas and to get people thinking, right? After a certain point, though, I think we get tired of talking.
Yeah.
My observation is that often at the expense of talking, we are not very good at executing.
Yeah.
Right? Leaders, organizations, you've been in settings before where people will throw all these ideas on the wall and then they all die, right? Because
Yeah.
we don't execute well. What do you say to the people that are listening? What do you say to the people that may watch this later? What do you say to you and I, just as friends, who at some level are just, we're exhausted at the talking. We're exhausted because it's easy to post this stuff on social media, right? To do a like,
Yeah.
post a comment, to make a
Yeah.
hashtag, then move on.
Yeah. I mean, I think your question is definitely multi-tiered. I would say one thing is, yeah, you're absolutely right. The more we talk about an idea, actually it reduces our chances of actually executing on it, because I think it tricks our brain into thinking we're actually doing something by talking about it.
Wow.
And so at one level, I think that's a bad approach. The reality is that when you are truly caring about something, you're going to invest. I mean, we'll always make time and we'll always invest in things that we care about. And so part of an idea not seeing the light of day sometimes is because we don't know what problem we're solving. And I just wonder is that, if someone's trying to solve the problem, like, hey, I don't want to look bad of not being open to diversity. That's a different problem than figuring out why is it that there isn't enough access to people in underserved communities, in our city. That's a different type of problem you're trying to solve. If the problem you're trying to solve is really about image of how you're going to come off to your congregation or come off to people you're working with, come off to the Facebook community, that's a different problem than actually trying to create systemic change. That's a different type of problem solving than, say, a real estate company coming in and developing, creating gentrification, and not thinking about the ramifications of what that means for people who have to move out, the relationships, the jobs, all of the trickle effect that actually happens is like, I just wonder, like, are we all trying to solve the same problem? That I don't know. And I'm probably convinced there are probably all other motives or other problems people are really trying to solve, and not in this particular area we're talking about.
Wow. I don't know that I've thought about that way before. That maybe we've got to first agree on the problem. Like, do you even see this? So if I'm having a conversation with someone, I've got to first uh, almost do a triage to see if we even agree on what the problem is. Huh? Is that what you're
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's number one of any type of executing ideas, like frame the challenge.
Wow.
Think about this, like solving this from a perspective of saying, hey, we're going to create new programs that can help with racial equity, uh, combat racism, all of these kinds of things is one thing. Taking it to a different level and say, hey, we need to change the criminal justice system, is that type of reform is a whole nother level. And I think we have to agree, like, what is it that we're ultimately trying to march towards? And which elements of it can we individually tackle or in smaller groups to say, you know what, I may not be able to go change bills or pass legislation in the way that can help those who are, I think about everybody in the probation system and how easy it is to be just stuck there for the rest of your life. To change that kind of level of justice reform requires certain people in the room. Maybe I can't do that, but maybe I can work at a local community level to think about new projects that are coming into town to see, can I play a role in serving a community that may be overlooked or ignored or displaced? Those kinds of things, like, we got to figure out, like, what are we solving for at a grand level, but what are all the micro narratives that we're trying to create, and what role will I play in those narratives? And so if you are part of the denomination as predominantly a majority culture, what role will you play as a minority in that denomination to really create the movement at the highest levels of leadership to pioneer a path forward? And you could do that role, even if you're not always involved in a community effort or advocacy. So we just kind of have to get really, like, in the tactical side of it as well, and say, this is what I'm going to commit my life to. And I'm going to trust my brothers and sisters are going to do the same. And we're going to figure out how to help each other through this. But I know what my mission at task is right now in front of me.
Yeah, man. That's so powerful. That's so good. Because whether we're talking about organizations or business or family or church or social change, race issues, um, at a certain level, you could see the problem. And even before you get to the place of trying to define what the problem is, as you just said, you could almost feel stuck, feel paralyzed.
Absolutely.
Like, I don't even know where to start. I don't know if what I'll do will make a difference. Da 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 da. Like, you run down this list
Yeah.
of things that just sort of paralyzes you, and you don't know what to do.
Yeah. I've always learned from some of my mentors, like, you know, you don't have to change the whole world, but you can change your world. Whatever you can do in your world that you're probably naturally gifted at doing, you do that. It might be as simple as, like, saying, like, if I'm a college student right now, I would write about this topic on my papers. I would try to do presentations in classrooms with, if it's subject matter that kind of blends or yields itself to the subject you're in or a particular classroom, write papers about it. Like, I always tell that to college students, like, if you care about something, write about it, videotape about it, do something with it, even if it's just at an awareness level. Now, if you're, in a place where you can hire people and you're an employer, think about who you're hiring. It's all of these, like, little things that we can all do that collectively make impact. And I believe that the majority of people have that heart. And, it's finding what I can do is really not difficult. And if you start thinking in terms of, like, I'm not here to change the way that Americans think about race. I need to figure out, how can I be the best example of what I think our world should be like in my day-to-day engagements with our customers and, with our, with our employees and with our vendors, those kinds of things. I feel like that's where real, justice can kind of spring up. And then you need others. Like I have friends who are leading like everything from Black Lives Matter movements and other places, like, but I can't do that because I probably would never be the face for that, you know? And it's okay, but I can find other backdoor ways of supporting what they're doing. And I feel like together we can make a difference.
Yeah. So let me ask this, because I've seen you before work with organizations around brand attributes,
Yeah.
branding, and where there's alignment and consistency around the brand and the message and the actual culture and activity and behavior of the organization and the people that lead that organization, and really address dissonance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be just transparent here for a moment. We're recording this. Somebody may watch this later, but we're fresh off. I mean, very fresh off of seeing about the story in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Right? And I saw a pretty well-known religious leader post about it, and suggest, man, this is not good. The officers need to be fired. They need to be arrested. But 3 or 4 posts earlier, there's a post from this same leader highlighting a federal program and a federal leader who has a track record of demeaning and really tearing apart groups of color, people of color.
Yeah.
So when I see that, it creates this disconnect for me. Like, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think, people who have not taken the time to try to connect ideas with each other, I see this all the time. Like even in churches, sometimes I'll hear someone speak and they'll promote one theological view, and then the very next sentence take something from, a completely contrary view of their other view to make a point. And this is where I think the problem is that we often find news and other things to kind of, if you will, in a church-like way, proof text my belief and try to back it up with sources, because the church generally banks on authority and whoever you can like quote, or which theologian you study from, or all of these matters. And there's nothing wrong with like research and doing all of that, but I feel like there is a disconnect because we don't always see, like, and it might be because of the nature of social, you see something and you want to react to it. We've gotten in the habit of being distributors of news, even as we critique the news and media, right? And so just quickly, sharing left and right without thinking in terms of, okay, what does this piece of content, what does this idea mean for what other things I believe in? So simultaneously, a good silly example would be is like, I don't know how many times I've heard in church, like, it's not by accident you're here today. And then on the next breath it says, you need to choose. Right? And it's like constant, like, and it's like people in the world, like, I'll believe it when I see it. And then they'll say, I can't believe what I'm seeing, under the same breath. So it's like this disjointed view of justification of belief, and not doing the hard work of saying, okay, if I believe in this element of this particular bill being passed by this leader, and then I see this other incident happening, how am I going to reconcile those two? Instead, some people, it might be easier to say, hey, I'm going to please one crowd by putting this, and I'm going to please my other group of friends by putting something else here. And so I feel like that's where, I kind of like, I have some empathy because everything's happening so fast. And if you're like me, I'm not always the best one of connecting all the ideas. It takes me a lot of time. So when I'm sitting on a panel and someone asks me a question, there's a good chance I've thought about it, I've written about it, I've done something about it, because if I didn't, I probably would have a really ridiculous answer. So I mean, for me, it takes time, but others can do it, but some don't take time. And honestly, that's where I think a lot of inconsistency comes.
Yeah, I've seen you do that. Like in real time, I've seen you, like, if you don't have an answer, there's this not awkward, but there's this pregnant silence. And you're like,
Yeah.
okay, is Charles processing, or is he getting ready to say something like there's going to be a mic drop? Yeah, I've seen that
Yeah.
in real time. In real time,
Yeah.
man. I tell you, this is for a lot of people, just you have to fight to not get numb.
Yeah.
You really have to fight not to get numb and jaded. Is probably a better word.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, but I think part of this is it's like a coping mechanism, right? You see something, you're like, that can't be real. And
Yeah,
you think about it and you're like, oh my gosh, it's totally real. And then it happens again. And you're like, no, it didn't happen again.
yeah,
And it's possible that because that pain is so great when you actually sit and think about it, that it might be easier to, medicate yourself with some level of callousness to say, well, that's just the reality. And our brains work that way. When I think about ideas, is like we have to create narratives in our head to cope with whatever situation we're in. And some
yeah,
of that narratives may be false, but it's helpful.
yeah,
So I don't blame people for finding themselves in those moments, but that's not sufficient enough to say we should stop thinking about it. And I don't know always when there's like the fine balance, because I see some of my friends are super proactive when it comes to this topic and to this issue, that burn themselves out. And but I understand, but I also feel like there are times where we need certain leaders to burn themselves out to remind us of why this is still so important. And so yeah, it's easy to get numb, and I don't blame people for being, I think that's human nature. But let's not let our numbness stifle, or let's not our numbness become a barrier to progress.
yeah,
It's not a good enough excuse not to seek progress because we're numb.
yeah. I wonder though, um, and I thought you were getting ready to say this, but you didn't. You went another direction. I wonder where the balance is, because for me at least, very
Yeah.
transparently, I'll share. I don't know if I'm not in a place where I can consume this all the time and
Yeah.
still have a clear head. Like there have been times where something happens socially or a justice issue happens, and it's like I get sucked into this rabbit hole, and now I'm looking at the video or I'm looking at the post, and the more I sit there and stew on it, the more distorted my perspective becomes, even about other stuff.
Yeah.
And for me at least, I found that's not healthy. So I'm like,
Yeah.
so what's the balance? Like what's the balance in being conscious and aware and woke and engaged and on mission
Yeah.
without getting sucked into the the cesspool, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
I would say balance is a myth. And let me explain. um, you know, I think one of my mentors, he would always say, it's really not balance in the sense, like, in order for something to be balanced, like nobody else can move in your life, right? Your kids can't get in trouble, other things can't happen in politics. Everyone has to stay still for balance. And I
Yeah,
feel like that's not the real world we live in.
yeah,
Look at like an object like a fulcrum, right? Where you're trying to balance like a pencil. If you have pressure on one side, you just adjust the center. And I think part of adjusting the center is being in community with other people.
mm,
This is not an area that you can figure out by yourself. It's too big for any of us. And
yeah,
I feel like we have to figure out, where do we find a community of people that can move with us, so that in moments where we feel like totally discouraged, that someone will choose to say, like, we have a thing within our team, like, we can't all be negative at the same time. Someone has to fake it and act positive. Okay. But you have a community that understands that. Or if you're shifting to the other side where you're in a really good place, you should be the one kind of standing up and saying, hey, let's go in this direction. I'll take more of the load. So I feel like part of the solution of this is not just you creating space, which is all good. Like, mental health and wellness is central to anything we do in life. But I feel like we have to also then get to a place where we say, you know what, we have to surround ourselves with people who are not exactly like us, but that we can trust to say, hey, we'll journey through this together, because it's too hard. It's like mentally draining. You don't want to look at the news all the time, right? but want people who aren't informed. So maybe you could surround yourself with people not that only read the news, but actually read the scholarly articles,
Yeah.
read some of the historic, context for some of the challenges, and better understand the issue more holistically. So you're not relying on one source to say this is good or bad.
Yeah. It's interesting. One of the things that I prayed at the beginning of this year, in some ways, the last year or so, I felt like I was in somewhat of a bubble in terms of my thought processes. And so one of the things that I prayed about was the intentionality of at least having some exposure and the opportunity to be able to have conversation with people that were different than myself, right?
Mhm.
Just to keep my mind sharp,
Yeah.
just to keep my theology solid, right? Because I think sometimes if we stay in a place where everybody is what's called like the echo chamber,
Yeah.
where we got that theology. Not that my theology is going to change, but I need to be able to have better ways sometimes and sharper ways to explain what I believe and why I
Yeah.
believe what I believe, et cetera, et cetera. And so I got connected to this group that, like, once a week or twice a week, we get on these things, Zoom calls now since the pandemic. And, these are people that are, in some cases, I'm the only minority sometimes on these
Mm.
calls. In other cases, I may be the only male, just whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so this guy said to me on one of the calls, and he was in the Pacific Northwest. He said, "I live in a rural area. Um, there are almost no minorities, no people of color in my area. I'm not afraid to go into a coffee shop, and if I see somebody of color, I don't mind sitting down talking with them. But how do I intentionally put myself in a place where I'm gonna have conversations with people different than me?" And I hadn't really thought about it that way, right? Because there are some people that are literally in places where it's not that diverse.
Yeah.
What do you say to them, Charles?
I say, like, it's in those type of scenarios, it's not even just about like racial diversity. What I know from like years of just working on innovation and ideas and those kinds of things is that, you know, innovation is often the result of two or more seemingly unrelated ideas or people intersecting.
Mm.
And so even, regardless of the
Wait a minute.
color,
Hold on. Back up.
yeah.
Say that again. Say that.
Yeah,
Say
so
that again.
innovation is often the result of two or more seemingly unrelated ideas intersecting.
Wow.
What I encourage is we have to be in environments that are unfamiliar to allow things that seem or people that seem totally unrelated to us to come into our space, to be able to spark something that we had not thought about before. And this is kind of the benefit of living a diverse life. So whether it is someone's race, whether it's a subculture group, whether it's someone's age, whether it's, any of those factors, sexuality, all of these kinds of things, I think are good for our souls if we can kind of hold it with an open hand. And it's not to say you won't disagree with people, but if you don't know how people think, so one of the things that I think I may have shared with you in this past is like, I always try to go to gatherings. I mean, right now we can't, but even virtually, like, go to things that are not in my space, just to kind of see how people solve problems, how they think about the world. And that makes me a better thinker. So
Yeah.
when I come back, I could really process it. And so, I feel like for people like that, they feel like they're not running into people. I'm sure there are people that are not like them. And it may not be a racial difference, but there are plenty of people that are not like them. I would say just get in the habit, and of course don't like exclude people because of racial differences, but just be open to people who don't look, talk, think, view the world like us.
Yeah. Some of my best ministry ideas have come when I was in non-ministry spaces.
Mhm.
It's mind-boggling, that as you say, you can make a connection. If I remember correctly, it's a term called boundary spanning, right?
Mhm.
Where you intentionally extend the boundary and extend the boundary to learn from an industry or a space or a
Yeah.
leader that's totally not, you know. I was listening to this guy talking about one time, artificial intelligence,
Mm.
and like just in a almost like in a totally fly by night statement, like totally aloof to him. and I don't even know if he knew there were some faith leaders in the room, but he was like, what is artificial intelligence going to look like with my faith? And then like he moved on to the next subject, right?
Yeah, yeah,
He's talking about coding and algorithms, and then just
yeah,
kind of threw that in.
yeah,
And I got stuck there though, because like my light bulb is going off, and I'm like, wow, man, like that's next level right there.
yeah, yeah. And if you ever one day want to talk about AI and faith, we could have a separate conversation. I have ideas.
Oh, that's gonna be the next video. We got to talk about it, Charles.
I love it. I mean, yeah, I think it's really that's where the genius is at, right? Either it's an insight or a way of like framing something and taking that into a different space to let it kind of breathe. And this is what made like, all of the, if you look at all of these great thinkers or even in the faith, like people like the C.S. Lewis's of the world who wrote these great books, part of their genius is they found themselves in places like pubs and bars and different social settings that had like everyone from lawyers to, judges to scientists to poets and artists, all living life together. And that's what kind of sparked those wow moments where you're like, man, I could take that from medicine and apply it to legal. I could take something from legal, apply it to my nonprofit work. I could take something from business and apply it to my education. So like that's where the beauty happens. And for us to like prevent ourselves from experiencing that depth and breadth of great perspectives that can make our lives better too is silly. And I feel like that's what human beings are missing out by not welcoming enough people that are not like them.
Yeah, and really from a race standpoint, I mean, we're going to kind of make this full circle now. We're going to land this plane here in just a moment, but it's really interesting because you and I both saw it, and other people that were on that post that I
Yeah,
posted about diversechurchjobs.com. I mean, we literally saw people using scripture to justify
yeah,
staying isolated and separate.
yeah. Yeah, I think that was where like, I don't know, maybe it was some of my graduate studies in philosophy and part theology is that like, I feel like we unjustly pull passages out of context. I often wonder, like, if we were to go to biblical authors today, I don't know, say we got up to heaven and we're talking to the Apostle Paul, and we're just like, what do you think about, like, virtual reality or mixed realities? And, this passage talks about this and that. And if we were to approach him with that question, I'm sure he may have a blank kind of stare right back. I was like, what in the world are you talking about? Because I didn't intend this verse to answer all of your political questions.
Yeah,
And I feel like there's this sense like because God's word is good and it's, has authority, that we try to make sure it fits into every single thing that I do. And I feel like in the process of that, even with good intent, we end up stretching text that really never meant to answer some of the questions that we have. And that's where we probably get debates on whether something written in scripture is simply describing what happened back then,
yeah.
or prescribing what ought to happen every single time for the rest of your ministry.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about wisdom, because I don't know that I think wisdom answers the question. When you're in a situation, you're going to ask what's the wisest thing to do. But I don't
Mm.
have a actual prescription here. If I don't have a black and white answer, what is the
Yeah,
wisest thing to do, and what do I want the story to say on the other side of this?
yeah,
And that kind of thing. So yeah, man, you and I, of course, we could talk for hours. Let me ask an off script question really fast,
yeah.
because I know you've got your incredible wife and you have two kids. What kinds of conversations do you and your family have when you guys are just around the house about some of these things that are happening?
Yeah, I mean, we usually say, like, look, every crisis probably also comes with great opportunities. And the fact that, if you look at some of the great companies that have come out, whether automotive companies to technology companies, they're often at the tail end of some type of like recession, some type of challenges in society, post-war. So I know that even when it's hard, when things are scarce, sometimes clarity rises, sometimes innovation rises, And so we're thinking in terms of like, how do we maximize the opportunities that are set before us? So we stop and keep reminding ourselves like, this is horrible. And I think there needs to be time to grieve about everything that's happening. I have just too many friends who have, closed companies or thinking about closing their businesses, and it's making a tangible impact in their day-to-day living. Their mental state, all of those kinds of things have been, to some, very devastating. They've lost loved ones, and so in the midst of that, for whatever reason, we haven't had that level of suffering.
Hmm.
And regardless of that level of suffering, we always think in terms of like, what can we do? Like, what can we do to better serve people? What can we do if we have since we have some resources? How do we distribute that to people that need it? And so we're thinking in terms of like, a crisis is an opportunity to do good. So what is it that we can do? Not expecting anything in return. We just feel like it's the right thing to do. And as long as we have mental energy to think in that type of positive light, I want to encourage my kids, our entire family, to say, hey, let's keep thinking that way. Because there may come a time where we can't do that.
Hmm.
And we're going to need our friends to pick us up. But in those moments, I want them to know that when we're in a place of like advantage or even privilege, that type of language, is that we want to give where we can. And that was kind of the reasons why we started, like, even as a company, just generating massive amounts of content lately, is because, like, yeah, a lot of the content we used to just give to our clients, but now we feel like, man, people really need some of this good content and insights from different industries. And so we've been kind of pushing it out, not to sell anything that our business does, but we feel like it's the right thing to do given where we have the fortune of being.
Yeah, no, man, I and I've seen you live that out. I mean, one of the first webinars that I was on when this pandemic started was one that you gathered leaders who generally would not be, on a call together,
Yeah.
to just conversate. And I'm on this call with folks with military expertise,
Yeah.
folks that are in for-profit space, folks that are running large companies, and folks that are running small companies
Yeah.
from the homes. And but it was so inspiring just to see the synergy that was created on that call, man. And even now, I mean, on LinkedIn, there's some folks that I've connected with since then, and we've been able to kind of create some dialogue and conversation. So I
So,
appreciate what you've done and what you're doing, my friend.
no, I'll do what I can with what I have, and I'm going to trust all my friends and relationships are going to do the same. So, like, you've been doing it, so many other friends have been doing it, and so
Yeah,
I feel like there's still a majority. I want to believe a majority of people that believe in the best in each other,
yeah,
and I believe that in the long run, we're going to win. It
yeah,
doesn't matter how much hate there is in the world. At the end of the day, there's going to be enough good people that care deeply about this that will say, no, not on our watch.
yeah.
And it may not be perfect, but it's going to be better and better as time goes by, because we're going to get more people to do what we think, we ought to do together.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask you to do something. We didn't talk about this or script this, but I'm gonna ask you to pray for us as we
Yeah.
close out. But before I do that, I just want to mention, what you just said. Um, I'm with you. I'm holding out hope and believing that no matter how bad these things are, I mean, literally this week, we still are trying to catch our breath from the young man who was running in a
Yeah.
neighborhood and was gunned down, and then you got two more situations that sort
Yeah.
of come and punch you in the gut, and you're like, oh my God, not again.
Yeah.
And yet we still hold out hope. One of the things that I posted on social media earlier, that I believe that at some point we're going to look back at these moments and realistically be able to see a moment marked in time where all of us collectively said enough is enough, and we started to see systemic change actually take place. I,
Yeah.
I believe that in my gut. I don't know how. I don't know when that'll be, but I believe that. And so
Yeah.
I said that for what it's worth to concur with you that the believers, those that follow Jesus Christ, we if we give up hope, the world really is going to be without hope. So yeah, thank you,
Yeah.
Charles, for your friendship, and thank you for what you shared tonight.
No, I really believe, like, and I know it's not just like a wishful thinking. I just know too many people that are doing the good work.
Yeah.
that probably aren't known by everybody, in our network of friends,
Yeah.
that are behind the scenes passing legislation and bills and making sure there's accountability. So I don't want us to lose hope in the midst of the headlines.
Yeah.
And so, and having worked closely with a few of them at a pretty high capacity
Yeah.
that are literally changing lives, I think it's our part is do what we can in our sphere of influence that we have, so that collectively we're going to really change I think the trajectory of what history may look like here in the U.S. So yeah, let me pray. Father, thank you so much for this time. I know that all wisdom ultimately comes from you, and I pray, Lord, that you would give us clarity on the areas in which all of us listening to this can participate. Whether it's grand or really small, it doesn't matter. Let us do our part. And I pray, Lord, especially for those who have been personally impacted by all of the injustice we're seeing right now in the news, that you would be with the families, you'd be with the fathers, the mothers, the aunts and uncles, the children, that you would be with them tonight, even as they mourn. And that you will give us clarity and creativity and innovation on how we ought to move forward. And we entrust all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, my friend. So appreciate you. And we're going to keep pushing together.
Awesome. Thanks.
Peace. Hold on for a moment.